Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to This Medical Life podcast. These are the stories of medicine with Steve Davis and Dr. Travis Brown. This is the story of stories. Dr. Travis Brown, you've lured me into the studio and you haven't told me anything about what's about to be discussed. So this is the ultimate act of trust.
It is, and thank you for your trust. Put
those latex gloves away.
This is coming back into 2025, and I was writing some stories. Sometimes we do some radio segments, and you pull together some medical stories that I enjoy and share with a lay audience. Try not to be too medical, try not to be too graphic, because sometimes that can cause some issues. But
you think I'm up for it?
I think you're ready for it. I think you've probably been well exposed to a good medical stories. And one is actually associated with the Manhattan Project, and then I'll come to when I came to the other story after the break. But one of the people that I work with came up to me and said, "Have you heard the story of the Demon Core?" I was like, "Oh, I haven't heard of that." And so this is where that story came from. And this was part of, this is Oppenheimer, come out, and part of that project of the Manhattan Project. And again, this began in 1941, the creation of the atomic bomb. And some of the story, I always find this fascinating because it's, created, almost a deviation in our time, sort of a history where there was this moment that just changed everything. And this was creation for the atomic bomb. But there's some stories around the Manhattan Project, and this one is kind of unbelievable as to how it sort of occurred. And this was, look, they were pushing the boundaries of physics at the time. They knew about the risks of radiation, but weren't overly cautious about it. Now, they had about 25 years of working with radiation. They knew that it was dangerous. They knew it could kill. They knew it could damage cells. And there was this experiment, this demonstration that became known as tickling the dragon's tail. And this is when Louis Slotin, who was a Canadian physicist who was working at the Manhattan Project, would bring together two halves of an exposed plutonium core to the point of criticality.
But what is the point of criticality?
So the premise of the nuclear bomb is you have to combine enough nuclear material that creates a self-sustaining chain reaction. So you have enough of the atoms and the mass that once this chain reaction happens, it just continues to happen until eventually you get transformation of atoms, and then you get this release of energy. Now that release is the atomic bomb. That is, you just put these atoms all together, and that's what the theory is. You get enough nuclear material, it will create this chain reaction, and it will release a huge amount of energy. Now, what Lewis was doing was he was bringing two halves of plutonium together just close enough that the neutrons from the plutonium would start to shoot off. So you would start to get that first moment of close enough to have that chain reaction starting. And these weak reactions, you could measure and gather the data.
And this would all be done within the realms of health and safety.
This was done in a room with two halves of plutonium. And he kept them separate by holding a screwdriver. And so he would bring them together, hold a screwdriver together. You would see just these weak reactions happening, or you'd be able to measure that. Now, his boss said to him, if you keep doing this, you're going to be dead within a year. So they knew that this was like a party trick that, you know, your dad would do to, like, you know, hey, watch me jump off the garage and see if I can sort of land well.
Wow, you had a very different upbringing.
And on one day, he was demonstrating this to a colleague, Elvin Graves, and the screwdriver slipped. So the two halves of plutonium came together. There was a flash of blue light, a blast of heat, and the Geiger counter in the room rattled. And Lewis quickly pulled the two halves apart, and there were 8 people in the room at that time. They all knew what had just happened. They were the scientists and this conducting this, you know.
I wouldn't call it an experiment at this point.
It's insanity. But they evacuated the lab. The ambulance was called. Scientists were then frantically trying to work out how much radiation they'd been exposed to. Now, Lewis sketched out where everyone stood in the room, and they used a Geiger counter because they wanted to say, okay, what have we just been exposed to? Measure some things in the room so that we know how much radiation has been exposed to us. And so they measured a Bristol brush, an empty Coke bottle, you know, a hammer, some measuring tape, and they used the Geiger counter. But the measurements, unfortunately, were unreliable because the Geiger counter itself had been exposed to the radiation. And so they later actually did a report on this, and they said one of their conclusions is once you've been exposed to radiation, like, you're not really capable of rational thought. And so you're sort of, you know, frantically trying to work things out. So their conclusions were kind of put aside. The calculations they did afterwards was the exposure that these people had gotten was 1 million times smaller than the first atomic bomb. So it was just a big flash. The problem was they knew the way they measured that a fatal dose for humans was 500 REM. Lewis was estimated his whole body had received 2,100 REM. And his left hand that was closest to the core at the time had received 15,000 REM. Now, so everyone went to hospital, but here was kind of almost the world's worst kind of experiment where they then were able to work out what is radiation sickness with just a big flash, being able to, you know, one big moment. And Lewis's first symptoms was vomiting, which during the night, which settled the next day. And for the next few days, his health actually seemed fine. But then his left hand started to become numb and tingly. It started to become very painful. So this is the thing that received the most radiation. It changed colour, it got blisters, it became this dusky blue. And on day 5, his white cells dropped, became nauseous, got abdominal pain, high fevers, weight loss. And effectively what he had done is they said he'd had internal radiation burns. And the doctors at the time tried to sort of equate this as saying, well, this is like a 3-dimensional sunburn that the patient received. And on day 7, Lewis became confused. He had blue lips and eventually became into a coma. And on day 9, he died. And he was the age of 39 with just a huge acute dose of radiation. Now, the person that he was demonstrating this for, his name was Elvin Graves. And he was a scientist that Lewis was demonstrating this for. And he was standing next to Lewis when it was happening. Now, he became critically ill, but he did survive. The difference is he lost his vision in his left eye. His fertility was affected for several months, as you'd expect. His white cells became critically low to the point that doctors didn't quite know how he was surviving. And he lost a lot of hair, which, again, took a long time to grow back. The strange thing about Elvin, though, is he remained on the Manhattan Project and even went on to oversee a whole bunch of nuclear bomb experiments in the tests in the Pacific. And what they ended up looking at was saying there was another accident with this same core where someone was building it together, and the brick that they were putting on to encase the core dropped and hit the actual core again, and a burst of radiation came out. And this is how it became known as the demon core, because of these accidents that were happening, quote unquote, with this experimentation or building it. And so
I've just got to ask one thing before the doctors treating these patients immediately after the dragon's tail exploded the first time, these patients would have still been radioactive, wouldn't they?
Well, yeah, and that's also part of it. Like, again, were they radioactive? And this is an experiment in, people potentially took some precautions, but again, we didn't know that much. So you are radiating energy at that point in time. And so that's why, people wear shields these days, or people under radiation therapy, because we know that treating patients with this kind of energy that's coming off them can be damaging to the people treating them. And again, this was something completely new. And of the 8 people in that room that day who had ended up surviving a year, what ended up happening was 4 of them died of radiation illness, and 4 survived beyond 30 years past the event. And so it really sort of indicated how close to a radiation exposure you can be and still recover from it. But it's just an insane experiment that you think about someone with 2 plutonium halves sort of testing it with a screwdriver in between.
I think I'd much rather take your dad jumping off the garage. Now, the screwdriver holding the 2 halves of this episode has just dropped, and they're coming close together, Dr. Travis Brown.
That story, and I was looking at it and sort of, okay, we're coming back. And that story set me on a weird path. And the path was, looking at nuclear medicine. It was coming on through. It was looking at a lot of the stories, and it took me down sort of a rabbit hole, and radiation, death, destruction, nuclear bombs, and on one hand you have the greatest minds of our generation the generation at the time created the world's greatest killing machine or device, just sort of, and I went sort of, and I actually became quite.
Did it bring you down?
It did. And I was sort of like, starting 2025, and then you're looking at all the world current events, everything that's going on. And I sort of looked at it and I thought, I can't go into these stories. They're not uplifting. They're, even an aside, you said there you go, the demon core in itself is such an odd story, and it sort of took me down a weird path. And I looked at it and I thought, I need some inspirational stories. I want to look, this podcast, I want to sort of be a celebration in part of some of the minds that are people who have used their knowledge or used some in an inspirational way. And so that put me down a path of, looking at doctors and carers, scientists. We've mentioned, a few of them, like, Frederick Banting, who was the co-discoverer and developer of insulin. They patented insulin, the insulin and manufacturer, but they sold it to the University of Toronto for $1 because, insulin belongs to the world, not to me. And, we had John Langdon Down, 19th century in Normansfield, who was a hospital or a homestead for the intellectually disabled children. Now we know majority of them would have had what we call Down syndrome after John Langdon Down. And, these children were taught in the 19th century to ride and clean stables, grow vegetables. And it was just, I came across 3 people that I'm sad to say I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't know their stories. I didn't know their achievements. I didn't even know their names. And their impact has revolutionized medicine. Their determination is remarkable. And their names is Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, Dr Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and Dr Emma Constance Stone.
Why is it not surprising me that three people fundamental in the world of medicine who are women are not well known?
Right. And these are the first women to be registered as medical practitioners, first in the United States and in England and in Australia, respectively. And so they are pioneers. And their challenges I want to just get into. I want to tell a bit of their stories. The first is Elizabeth Blackwell. Now, she was born in 1821. She was born in Bristol in England. Now, she moved to America at the age of 11 with her family, and her father is said to have wanted to move, firstly for financial reasons, but also had an interest in abolishing slavery, and America was where that was at the time. And they were a politically active family, and Elizabeth and her sister was active in women's rights and the anti-slavery movement. Now, she didn't have any interest in medicine. She was actually preferred history and metaphysics, and she went into teaching. But she became interested in medicine when one of her close friends, who was dying, said she would have been spared a lot of suffering if her doctor had been a woman.
Wow.
And so that statement of a dying friend has revolutionized medicine. Now, Elizabeth had no idea how she could become a doctor because women were not permitted universities. They were not permitted to study medicine. There was no avenue to go and do that. Now, she had some friends who were physicians who thought it was a fine idea, but it was too expensive and women couldn't do it. And so Elizabeth thought there had to be a way. And so while she was teaching, she boarded with two physician friends who mentored her for a year. Now, she applied for all the medical schools in New York and Philadelphia and 12 in northeastern states. Now, she was accepted into Geneva Medical College in 1847, but this was the dilemma that the medical college found, was no woman had ever been allowed to study medicine before. And so the faculty, the all-male faculty of the Geneva Medical College, believed that the all-male student body would never agree to a woman joining their ranks. So what they did, the faculty allowed the student body to vote on her admission.
Okay.
They voted yes as a joke.
Oh, this is just a cruel twist. But go on. Yes.
Because the vote was a valid vote, she gained admittance to the Geneva Medical School despite the overwhelming protests of the students and faculty. Even though she was accepted, she was able to study the course but faced a huge amount of discrimination and sexism. Professors forced her to sit separately in lectures, as well as often excluded her from labs. Now, the local townspeople also shunned her as a bad woman. Regardless of all these obstacles, 2 years later, she became the first woman to receive an MD degree from an American medical school. She graduated in 1849. Now, she went on to go to London and Paris for further training, but again hit the proverbial wall there and was forced to work in either as a midwife or in nursing roles, so wasn't accepted as a colleague. Now, she returned to New York in 1851, but again had difficulty finding work from hospitals or clinics or patients coming to see her. So she opened up her own clinic, and what she ended up doing was treating poor women. Difficulty paying, but she was going to treat women. The next 6 years became very successful. And she then opened up in 1857 the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. Her sister, Emily, who was now also a doctor and colleague with Marie Zagorowski, then joined together and they planned to create their own hospital, treat patients, and provide positions for other women doctors. from there, I'm sure it wasn't smooth sailing at all. But by 1868, Elizabeth opened up a medical college in New York City. And by 1875, she moved to London and was the professor of gynecology at the New London School of Medicine.
Can I just for one moment, we've rushed through that first college, just day in, day out for 2 years, at the school, in the township, being shut. It's phenomenal on that level alone that she did not give up. And then to continually, I'm saying the words, but I don't know how to process what that emotional and psychological tyranny would have been like.
It's kind of it's difficult to understand how she just didn't give up because everything would have been everything would have been a challenge. But, the place that you live was, a bad one. Just...
As I understand the way the brain evolved, its one mission is to keep us alive. And it would have been screaming at her internally to leave, to flee, to get to safety. And she would have had to subjugate those rightful intuitions and drives and push on regardless. It's a phenomenal story.
Yeah. And so that brings us to Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who was born in London in 1836. And again, she was in England. Women are not permitted to study medicine. They're not allowed to go into universities or education is barred, except for a few areas. But now she applied to go to medical school, but clearly all were rejected, and she was accepted into nursing at Middlesex Hospital. What she did, though, was she attended all-male doctors in training courses and subjects turned up, which I'm sure she was quite conspicuous there. But this resulted in a huge amount of complaints.
And what year was this again?
This was this would have been 1840s, 1850s.
Okay. Yeah.
These huge number of complaints, and she was banned from attending those all-male medical in doctor training courses or subjects. And so what she ended up doing was she applied to the Society of Apothecaries. So this is pharmacy. They could manufacture, prescribe, dispense medicines. And so this caused a bit of a controversy because there was no laws banning going into the apothecary. And so she was permitted to study them privately for the exams.
Right. I'm not sure how that works.
Well, yeah, she was permitted to do that. Subsequently, the board banned further women entering the apothecary.
So not her, but...
Not her. She was permitted to stay, but no one else could then enter as well. Now, so in 1865, she passed the exams and became a licensed apothecary. And it must have been around this time. It was hard to really nail it down. She crossed paths with Dr Elizabeth Blackwell.
Oh.
Now, it was that time she was running her own hospital in New York. And Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was then convinced to become a doctor. And so, again, no medical schools would admit her into England. So she learnt French, applied to the University of Paris, and was accepted. I don't know how hard studying a new language could have been. Just a remarkable achievement to learn a new language.
Can I say there's two languages here? There's the language of French, and then there's the whole medical language as well.
And so she then, a few years later, would become the first woman to receive a medical degree in France.
Right.
In 1870.
But there wasn't, just it happened that no women had applied there yet?
I don't one of those vagaries of sort of like, so did no one applied, or had they turned around, or was France... Well, it would have been the first woman. Were they more open to the idea or not? It just one of those parts of, I need to find more, but that's okay for the moment. And look, what happened in 1872? Well, Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson then went back into London and then changed St Mary Dispensary for Women and Children to become the new hospital for women in London. Now, this was a hospital run by women and staffed by women for women.
So one doctor
who was clearly inspired by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who would then come across and create a hospital for women in London. And so it was then in 1873, she was the first woman ever granted membership by the British Medical Association. It wasn't until 1876 that the House of Commons passed legislation prohibiting exclusion of women from universities and medical schools.
Wow, okay.
I can't imagine what her time must have been like, but setting up a hospital, and then only a few years later did they say you can't prohibit women studying in universities and medical schools.
And I wonder if that would have happened as the natural course of time or whether it was because of her work.
I'm sure it's because of these women that you push the boundaries and eventually understand. I have heard information, though, about that legislation, sort of a podcast, that it wasn't smooth sailing. There was huge protests about giving rights away, which is, again...
I mean, it was also the time of Oscar Wilde. Maybe there was some magic in the air.
And so that brings us to Dr Emma Constance Stone. Now, she was born in Hobart in 1856. Now, she was homeschooled by her mother with her sister. Now, her father was a builder and they moved to Melbourne. And she had an interest in anatomy, but again, no ability to be able to study medicine. And so she ended up becoming a primary school teacher, but clearly had an interest in becoming a doctor. And there's a bit of a gap here because she ends up turning 20. When she turns 28, she goes overseas to study medicine at the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania. And so that's a huge step. No ability. Universities will not accept women in Australia at that point in time to study medicine. So she goes overseas where, Elizabeth Blackwell has pioneered the way, forged the path, and created a medical college that accepts women in Pennsylvania.
And what era is this again?
This was 1870s.
Okay.
And so she then studied and graduated with first-class honours. And she ended up then moving to England and worked with Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who had just created the new hospital for women in London. And she then returned to Australia in 1890, and she was the first woman to ever register with the Medical Board of Victoria. And her sister, Clara, had been petitioning the University of Melbourne for several years at that time to accept women into medicine, and that was finally granted. And in 1891, Clara was able to enter medical school. Now, she became one of the first two women to graduate from Australia Medical College. And then Emma and Clara set up their own private practice, and they worked in a free dispensary in Collingwood. In 1895, they established the Victorian Medical Women's Society, and in 1896, 11 female doctors decided to set up their own hospital in Melbourne. And they changed the outpatients dispensary in Latrobe Street to become the Queen Victoria Hospital for Women and Children in 1899. Doctors at that point in time, they worked on a voluntary basis. Patients were treated for free, and even Dr Emma Constance Stone, daughter, would then come on and become a doctor as well.
But how do they continue when it's all voluntary? How is this funded?
So I don't know, and this is the whole part. Like, I found these stories inspirational because you were able to have three amazing women come up against a patriarchy and not take no for an answer. I discussed it with my wife, Kaz. These stories made her angry, which is understandable. So hopefully we haven't angered too much of the listeners, but you can see that this fundamentally changed medicine. We have women and children hospitals that are directly linked to these women who were pioneers in the industry.
And from a novel writing perspective, both you and I in our private time are writing novels. What an amazing setup for a novel. 3 women, 3 continents, and yet in each way they interlink. There's got to be a movie or a series.
There is a movie. The challenge with this is it's an ending that you sort of see, but it's an ending 150 years for away, and still struggle. There's still the struggle of women in medicine and everything. So but it is an incredible story. The part that I love so much about that is these medical students and all-male faculty thought they were being smart, having a joke, and someone took that and turned the tables completely around on them and became the first women doctor to graduate from medical school and then found a hospital. That to me is just amazing.
All those in favour of ending this episode, say aye. Aye. Oh, you weren't joking. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts on social media. Dr. Travis Brown can be found on X. His username is @Dr. Travis Brown. That's Dr. Travis Brown. And Steve Davis can be found on LinkedIn. Go to linkedin.com/IN/The Real Steve Davis. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.